I'm Jake Tapper from CNN. Thanks so much for having me here at the Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration Summit. I appreciate it. On this panel, obviously we have some of the nation's leading police chiefs and leaders to talk about how they're working to reduce crime and also incarceration. They believe that cutting incarceration and arrests can actually help promote public safety. It might seem counterintuitive to a lot of people, which is one of the reasons we're here to talk about it and explore the issues. A lot of people don't understand the basic concept of reducing both crime and incarceration at the same time. There are a lot of new public safety challenges in 2017. Obviously, we've seen an increase in murder in some cities. FBI statistics this week indicated an unfortunate spike in the deaths and the murders of police officers from 2015 to 2016. There's been a surge in opioid abuse in the nation, tensions that Attorney General Holder referred to between communities of color and law enforcement. And obviously also, as we're here to talk about, high incarceration and recidivism. These chiefs are trying to address the problems without repeating the mistakes of the past. It is unclear how the current Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, feels specifically about criminal justice reform. It doesn't seem to be the direction in which he's headed. He has ordered federal prosecutors to charge the highest count in all cases, to encourage officers to focus on low-level arrests. And he also has taken steps to reduce oversight of police forces. We'll find out what these leaders feel about these steps and these measures, and find out if they think that there's a better way or if they agree with the current leadership and its direction. Some of the chiefs that we have here, or all the chiefs here, we have with us from right to left, my right, Art Acevedo, who's the police chief of Houston, Texas, James Craig, who's the police chief of Detroit, Michigan, Peter Newsham, who's the police chief right here in Washington, D.C., Bill Scott, who's the police chief of San Francisco, Daryl Stevens, who's the executive director of the Major Cities Chiefs Association and the former police chief of Charlotte, North Carolina, Richard Stanek, who's the vice president of the Major County Sheriffs Association and also sheriff of Hennepin County in Minnesota. And last but not least, we have Ron Surpass, the founding chairman of Law Enforcement Leaders and the former police chief of New Orleans. So basically, I'd like to start just by going down the line and asking each chief why they are here, why they believe in this, and how their belief in criminal justice reform has manifested itself where they're from. So specifically with Chief Acevedo in Houston.
Hey, well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for the invitation, for being here. You know, I'm here because the strategies that we've been employing for the last couple of decades actually worked. And all you have to do is the proof is in the pudding. Look at the statistics, look at the data, and the data will show you that by engaging in community policing, by focusing more on reentry, by talking about childhood education, and the Ron Surplus, I have to add two bullets, two more bullets to your five, and we have to continue to engage in pre-K education. Today's kindergarten is not yesterday's kindergarten. You better be reading and writing, and it's a full day, not my 3 or 4 hours with naps and playgrounds when I was a kid. And we have to really treat adolescent behavior as that and stop the criminalization of adolescent behavior. When I was a kid, if I punched somebody in the school, there wasn't a school cop there to give me a summons or to treat me like a criminal instead of a kid trying to figure life out. And so in 2007, I became a police chief in Austin. And I remember at that time, Sheriff Hamilton's in the back, is my colleague and friend. We decided that we were going to start citing and releasing for minor offenses instead of wasting patrol time, really precious resources. And I remember if you think of Austin, it's a pretty progressive, it's probably to the left of, Moscow sometimes on some issue. That's the perception of that town, and it's probably pretty accurate. We were sandwiched between two very conservative communities, and Greg will remember that I was pretty much beat up by prosecutors that had a different perspective. Well, I'd just like to say that by focusing on violent crime, by focusing on treatment, on reentry, on education, on youth programs, what we accomplished, despite the fact we were the fastest growing big city under 1 million, we were a city that the police department was very under-resourced. We reduced violent crime by 40%, and that's something that we're very proud of. And we kept a fast-growing city safe. The same thing in Houston. Come to Houston, first thing I get to do is we're going to do our LEADS program. You know, we want to be part of the solution. The solution truly is, and one of the things that Secretary Kelly at the time, and now he's the Chief of Staff of the President, said when it comes to the war on drugs, he got it, and I hope that he will continue to push for it. We have a problem with drugs, but we have to address it by dealing with the demand piece of it. And that means we need to work on treatment, we need to work on diversion, and we need to work on reducing that. And there's a correlation between addiction and mental health, and we know that we're woefully not doing well in those. So I'm here because we need to, as practitioners, and by the way, when communities, especially communities of color, see police chiefs in the profession pushing back to try to keep heading in the right direction, it helps build legitimacy. Because what we're showing is, once again, the most maligned profession at times is the profession that, when it comes to either pushing back for criminal justice reform or training on implicit and explicit bias, it once again, it's the police profession that's doing that, and I'm proud of that, and I look forward to the conversation.
Chief Craig?
Thank you. Well, I'm excited to be here to tell the Detroit story. But as a backdrop, you know, I've had the good fortune of being the chief in 3 cities, starting first in Portland, Maine, Cincinnati, Ohio, and now in Detroit. The common denominator in every place, the good fortune of reducing crime in every city, but it was really our relationships that we established in the community. I'm talking about those relationships that are based out of trust. You know, a lot of departments, a lot of chiefs will talk about we have community policing, but truly, what is community policing? What does that really look like? And frankly, it's not talking to the community, it's talking with the community and coming up with solutions. I spent 28 years in Los Angeles, and I know my colleague William will attest to the fact that remember the war on drugs. Remember when the city had 2,000 murders. You know, I called it the blanket approach. So you go into a neighborhood with gang violence, crack, you lay this blanket over the neighborhood, anything moving or breathing, stop, and it just didn't work out. It was not good community relations, and certainly the violent crime continued. But going forward, the one thing that we have learned is these meaningful relationships. Now, when I talk about Detroit, I came into Detroit at a time where Detroit was faced with the largest municipal bankruptcy in this nation's history. In fact, did go through bankruptcy. Not only that, police officer morale was at the extreme bottom. The community morale was at the extreme bottom. In fact, the community had lost total confidence in the police department. So you had 2 things. And then you had the continued historic soaring violent crime in the city of Detroit. Now, when we look at crime, what do we think? Well, you know, it's no secret that Detroit is ranked, well, last year was ranked 4 and having the highest poverty rate, and before that, 3rd. So poverty and crime do go hand in hand. Mental illness and poverty, you know, we've talked a lot about mental illness, talked about drug use. The system is absolutely broken. From Maine to Cincinnati, where I was, and now here in Detroit, we have not, and I'm not talking about police, we have not done a good job. We put the Band-Aid on it, the 72-hour holds, they just don't work. We know factually that our response to critical incidents clearly, mainly surround dealing with the mentally ill. So facing these challenges coming into Detroit, low morale on both community and police, soaring crime, it was important to do this first. Police officers need to be supported. And frankly, that's what's been absent. It's people standing up and supporting police officers. Now, that doesn't translate into supporting bad police officers that engage in criminal misconduct. Certainly, an agency needs to be transparent. They need to be quick about making decisive actions and dealing with that issue. But the vast majority of police officers do it right. So by way of example, just recently, we're dealing with a couple of issues in Detroit involving police misconduct. So we know that we have well over 500,000 contacts, and that's a conservative number annually. any given 24-hour period, anywhere between 8 to 1,000. We get it right most times, 99.9% of the time. But when we get it wrong, we need to take responsibility for it and address it. So in the Detroit story, crime is trending down now in its 4th year, still going down, despite what you might have read about the FBI's report, and certainly at the appropriate time I can talk about that. Crime is going down. The community has confidence in its police department. Police officers want to be police officers again. And so there's some solutions that we've adopted that are unique to Detroit, and at the appropriate time I can talk about them. One is Green Light Detroit. Certainly that is a strategy and initiative that we believe has driven down violence and certainly the crime of robbery. Then Ceasefire Detroit, a unique strategy based in Detroit, the way we do it. I know it started in Boston, but we've seen violence go down dramatically because of ceasefire, not just in select neighborhoods, but we're in the process of spiriting it out throughout the city. And then lastly, there's a program at one of the trauma centers at Sinai Grace on the west side of Detroit called Live D. And in this program, medical professionals, trauma surgeons, a host of community stakeholders, and now police are involved in talking to young people who have been shot, because most of the young men who have been shot have also been perpetrators in violent crime. And so it works almost like ceasefire, but it has a lot of promise. And we believe with all of these strategies, they work together, we're continuing to see a decline in crime. So I'm excited about where we are in Detroit today. It has not been easy. It's still not easy, but we're certainly moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Chief Newsham, could you tell us about what you're doing right here in D.C. to affect criminal justice reform?
Ken, good morning, and welcome to Washington, D.C. For those of you who are not from our city, you have come to our city at a time when Washington, D.C. is thriving, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. I first want to mention, though, I'm pretty sure that the colleagues of mine that are seated here on the panel are a little jealous of me this morning. They had to select a shirt and a tie that matched. I was able to wear my uniform, which I know you guys, and some of you all did a better job than others. I'm not going to point anybody out. But Washington, D.C. is thriving right now. I always go around the city, and I think it's really important for folks to understand where we were not too long ago in Washington, D.C. with regards to crime and where we are today. I always show this chart of Washington, D.C., showing from 2009 to 2016 the reduction of violent crime that we've had in our city. And in 2016, we had the lowest number of reported violent crimes that we've had in Washington, D.C. since then, so it's about a decade. And then so far this year, we have another 25% reduction in violent crime in our city. And so, so they asked me to speak a little bit about some of the things that we have done. One of the things we did, which was a little controversial in policing, and it was a little difficult to implement, but at the beginning of 2016, we eliminated what were called our vice units. And what our vice units were these tactical units assigned to each of our districts. They were plainclothes units who went out into the community. They were kind of the right-hand group of our district commanders, and really they were a stat-driven group. They went out, and their goal was to go out and make arrests. And so they would generate a lot of arrests, but a lot of the arrests were possession-type arrests, drinking in public type of arrests. And, the community started to get a little frustrated. These groups were termed as jump outs. It started to get some attention in the media that these jump outs were indiscriminately jumping out on young men of color and violating their constitutional rights. So there was that tension there. The other thing that we saw is we weren't making a lot of a difference in the community. You arrest somebody on a possession case, or you arrest them on a drinking in public case, guess what? They're right back out there the next day. So there was a short term for the community. There was kind of a short term, while the police are doing a good job here, they've gone and they've made some arrests. We used to post, make it publicly known that we've made these arrests. But we weren't having any success in changing behavior. So what we did was we eliminated the vice units. We focused our narcotics efforts in one division in the city. We centralized it. We gave them additional training. And we wanted them to focus on arrests involving the people that were distributing drugs. And so this created quite a challenge for our district commanders, because I used to have this group that they used to be able to send out and say, look, we made 5 or 6 arrests, and the community would be appeased by that. So it became more difficult for our district commanders, and what we told them is, listen, you need to develop relationships with other city agencies that can provide opportunity to these folks that are hanging out on the corner causing these nuisance type situations. And I got to tell you, we still have violent crime in the District of Columbia. When I go to community meetings, the #1 complaint that I get is groups of young men hanging out on street corners, creating a nuisance. And there's a fear of some in our community to go to their local CVS because these groups of people are out here. So you have to communicate to the community exactly what you're doing. You got the district commanders and the other city agencies who can provide resources like, for example, jobs, mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment. You really have to get them engaged. And that progress for these groups is very slow. So you have to go out and explain to your communities, listen, you have to be patient with us. But I think if you look back and you show them statistics from 2009 moving forward, it is having a significant impact. The second example that I will talk about, and Art, you mentioned this a little bit, was the officers that we have in our schools, our school resource officers. They have been given a mandate, if at all costs, not to make arrests for kids who have come to school. Now, there will be situations where they'll have no other choice. There'll be violent crimes that time to time occur, or a gun may be brought into our school where we have no other choice. But by and large, what we're trying to do, first of all, if a kid arrives at school in the first place, you already got a kid who's moving in the right direction. You arrest that kid, and guess what? Now you've turned that kid's entire life around. So the mandate is to try to avoid arrests at all costs and try to mediate any type of things that happen in the school with the school administration. And I think that those approaches have been very, very successful for us here in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Chief Scott, can you talk about how your approach to this has affected San Francisco?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. So San Francisco, we are blessed in San Francisco. I agree with my colleague's assessment of things in terms of where we're trying to go in the criminal justice world. However, I think you have to have an infrastructure to support the many things that we're talking about in order to reduce crime and incarceration. So we're blessed in San Francisco that we have city leaders that do have that vision to create that infrastructure. In the city of San Francisco, we have a jail re-envisioning initiative. And basically, the whole strategy of that is to reduce jail incarceration. And the beautiful thing about this is that it just doesn't fall on the shoulders of the police department, because it takes a collaborative effort, really, to do what we're talking about. And with this jail re-envisioning initiative that the mayor has pushed forward, it does pull in all the agencies that it will take to achieve what we're trying to achieve here, and that's reduce crime while at the same time reduce incarceration. So we've had some success over the 2016 over 2015. We were able to do both. We were able to reduce the number of arrests, particularly Part 1 arrests, and at the same time reduce Part 1 crime, both property and violent crime. So this year we've had a fluctuation and a bit of an uptick. And the temptation is, when you have an uptick, it really causes you, in my opinion, to do some soul searching, because I think it's much easier to reduce incarceration when crime is going down, but when crime starts to go up, then the pressure starts to mount to do something, and particularly with police agencies, to do something to reverse that trend. So this year we're experiencing a little bit of uptick, and we have to dig really deep in order not to go back to what we know has been a temporary quick fix in the past. I mean, I came into law enforcement in the late 80s, early 90s, where crime was at its highest across the nation, particularly with Chief Craig. We were both in Los Angeles at the time. I spent 27 years there before coming to San Francisco. And there is an urge in times when crime is going up to go back to arrest your way out of the problem. And you really have to resist doing that. So there's a few points that I want to make before I close my opening that I believe we in San Francisco are doing in order to achieve the reduction in crime and incarceration. The first is community policing is, at its best, the best way to help reduce crime. Now, we are in a position, and we're fortunate that the U.S. Department of Justice in late 2016 entered in a collaborative reform initiative agreement with the city of San Francisco. And basically, what that means to our city is because of some high-profile use of forces, officer-involved shootings, and some other issues that had happened in the city, the community called for reform. So the chief at the time, Chief Sir, had the foresight and the vision to ask for the Department of Justice to come in and look at all of our practices and policies that got us to this point that call for reform. At the end of this process, we agreed to 272 recommendations that the DOJ put forth that we believe will make us a more transparent, a more bias-free police department, and a more accountable police department. What that does for community policing is it increases trust, and that's what I think is the linchpin of being able to reduce crime, is having a community that can believe in what you do as legitimate. So this Department of Justice reform, we believe, provides a roadmap for us to do that. Now, with the change of the administration, the DOJ concluded our reform work about a month ago and basically prematurely concluded, but we're committed to carrying that work forward because we do truly believe that if we do what we agreed to do, we're going to make our police department better. And that gets us to the 4 other areas that I think will help us reduce crime and incarceration. We have to find ways to reduce unnecessary arrests and unnecessary jail time. That's a part of our jail re-envisioning project in San Francisco, but also from a strategic standpoint, the police department has to have strategic strategies designed to address crime while at the same time not arresting everybody and doing so and swelling our jail population. That gets into closing that revolving door of recidivism. San Francisco has a issue with property crime, and what we tend to see is property crime offenders tend to go through this revolving door, multiple arrests before they receive any significant jail time. However, it frustrates the public because we make the arrests, they end up back on the streets to reoffend. So what's the answer to fix that problem? We believe that the answer is both community rehabilitative services and court-supervised services that bridges that gap to address some of the rehabilitation issues that will reduce recidivism. The next thing is mental health treatment and drug assistance. Many of our jail population in San Francisco, those are the issues. I think about 25% of the population is either mental health issues or drug assistance. So part of this strategy is to address those issues by working with our Department of Public Health in order to have more collaboration at the front end with mental health intervention and drug intervention, and we believe that's really going to pay dividends. We've entered into or got awarded a grant for implementation of a law enforcement assisted diversion or LEAD program that was really instrumental in Seattle making some headway in that area, and we believe that will also help address that issue. And then lastly, reentry, both from the planning standpoint and from the actual practical standpoint of reentry. In order to reduce the recidivism rate, police department has to be a part of that reentry process. We may play a small role in that, but we do play a role. So the collaboration between all the city agencies and the nonprofits and the agencies that have a stake in reentry really have to do it in two forms, in my opinion. The planning, once somebody goes into jail and they get booked, that planning needs to start immediately on what are we going to do in terms of getting this person back out into society in a meaningful way once they get released. And that planning has to be robust and collaborative. And then once they get out, the strategies on reentry have to be not only sustainable but effective strategies. So with those points, we in San Francisco truly believe that we can turn the corner on this. And we have an exciting time right now. I think we have a chance in law enforcement as leaders to really change the landscape of our criminal justice system. And with everything that's going on and help from all the collaborative partners in the federal government, we believe we can do just that.
Thank you so much. Darrell Stevens is a former police chief of Charlotte, North Carolina, and the executive director of the Major Cities Chiefs Association. Tell us, if you can, what you think the federal government can do to better support local police efforts. We've been hearing so many of these efforts. What should the federal government be doing better to help?
Thank you. It's good to join my colleagues here this morning to talk about violent crime and our responses and solutions and our ability to try to address that. We have seen increases over the past couple of years, and largely in our big cities. The 2016 data that was just released by the FBI, homicides in cities above 250,000 increased by 12%. That's basically driven the national increase. But this past year, I think there's some promise. Major cities has been collecting data on a quarterly basis from our large cities, and we've seen a decline so far this year. Not every place. We've got 8 cities in the first 9 months of the year that have seen increases above 15% in homicides, some significantly above that. But the trend over the past year has been declining. It's the first time we've seen that since like July or August of 2015 in the large cities in America. And so there is some promise that trend over the years that we've seen since the early 90s is coming back, and we can expect to see a decline in this year and hopefully in the future. But I think it's important for people to realize that even if we go back to the recent years and that trend, in the 1990s, early 1990s, we had 25,000 homicides in America. And so when we talk about 40 or 50% reductions, we've got 12 or 13,000 homicides in America. Anybody happy with that? Nobody should be happy with that number, because it's still way more than any other civilized country in the world, the lives that we're losing to homicides and violent crimes. So we've got a lot of challenges as in policing and in criminal justice, and there's basically a couple things that I think would be helpful for the federal government to do, and not just the federal government. This goes all the way through. Two of the strategic points that the law enforcement leaders are included in the letters, I think, are of critical importance to us. One is mental health and drug treatment. We simply have not invested in those two areas as much as we could, have not made those investments. And we've gone through some cycles where we've made more investments than others, but as the crime numbers go down and it leaves people's conscious, our investments in those areas go away. We can't effectively solve and deal with the problems that we have in violent crime and others if we don't provide mental health treatment and drug treatment. That's a key part of why we see people recycling through the criminal justice system. And the second point of the 5, they're all good, but these 2 stand out for me, and is the reentry program. Major cities chiefs have supported prison reform on a national level, supported several different proposals that ultimately failed in Congress. But as a part of that, you have to have reentry. There's been, again, a little investment made in that, but it's not sufficient to deal with the problems. Why would we expect that a young man coming out of prison with a record and all of the laws that were passed and requirements in the late 80s that says you can't get a job if you've got a felony conviction, why would we expect that young man to come out and be successful without any help if there's no chance for somebody hiring them because of that criminal record? What happens is they just go back into that same spiral, and we find them back in the criminal justice system again. Long term, we have to go in and work in our high poverty neighborhoods in a holistic way. We've got to engage, we've got to collaborate. Police, I think, can play key roles in leadership with that. But there's got to be services that help change that long-standing high poverty areas where even with crime below 50% below what it was 25 years ago, those neighborhoods can't say the same. They've felt some reductions, but those neighborhoods is where our violent crime is predominantly concentrated, and we're not going to resolve it unless we do some things other than arrest people and push them through the criminal justice system.
Sheriff Stanek, you run, obviously, prisons and jails in Hennepin County. Can you explain to people who might not understand the concept why you think jails should be used less frequently than they're being used, and what you're doing specifically in Minnesota to make that a reality?
Sure. Well, I appreciate that. And I just want to thank Nicole and the law enforcement leaders, staff, Ron, and others for getting us together. You know, I look around the room, a lot of friends here, a lot of people with a lot of years of experience. Just this panel alone, if I was adding up correctly, about 200 to 225 years of law enforcement experience. It's a long time. And we don't always get it right, but we try and do the best that we can. I've been a police officer myself for a little over 33 years. I was elected sheriff in my county, Minneapolis area, back in 2006. We're the largest county in the upper Midwest and one of the largest metropolitan urban areas in the country. I serve on the executive boards for major county sheriffs and national sheriffs, but I'm not here on their behalf. I'm here individually because I think, you know, the strength of this group from law enforcement leaders is individually we all have a voice. Collectively, we can do some great things together, and I think we're going to see that throughout the day. I see my job as a sheriff in three main areas. One is public safety enforcement, two is public policy advocacy, and three is public service, pure and simple. I joined the Law Enforcement Leaders Group a couple years ago at the urging of Ron and others so I can keep up to date on cutting-edge technology and best practices and learn from my colleagues across this country, and I have not been disappointed. I think to raise awareness about the challenges we face in doing our jobs and to identify some of the much-needed improvements for the criminal justice system, I'm also fortunate to have a great county attorney that works with me day in and day out, Mike Freeman, who's going to be speaking on the next panel. He does things for the right reasons. As such, sheriff's offices are a little different than local police chiefs, as some of you may know. I look at Sheriff Katusian, Sheriff Fitzgerald, former Sheriff Rohr, Sheriff Hamilton in the back of the room. We all have the same jobs at the end of the day, but the sheriff's offices are just a little bit different. The courts, warrants, civil process, jails primarily fall to the local elected sheriffs. We all do patrol, 911 dispatch, crime labs, investigations, and that's where we merge together with our police chief, our colleagues. But as the only sheriff on this panel, I also want to focus on what I see has become what I think is a misuse of our county jail, is getting right to the heart of it. Our jails should never be used as warehouses for the mentally ill or the chemically addicted. Everybody on this panel before me has said it, and others after me will say it, no doubt. In fact, last year at this time, we took a point in time of the booking population in a jail. About 52% came back treated, untreated, and mental illness, right? Those numbers are huge. I used to only think about 1/3. Some parts of the country would say 3/4. You know, we came back at 52%. That made a huge impact in terms of our county policy and where we're going. Jails should never be used as substitutes, as shelters for veterans and the homeless, and there should be no criminal penalties for being poor, simply said. Now, this should be news to no one here at the National Press Club or our colleagues in the room, and we need jail alternatives, community-based drug treatment programs, community-based mental health services, and of course, placements. And I'd venture to say, if I asked how many of you around the room, our criminal justice colleagues, are seeing the exploding opioid epidemic around this country like I've seen in my county, 153 deaths last year, a 39% increase. In 2017, I suspect it'll be another 15% on top of the 39% increase the year before. I bet all of you would probably raise your hands. But today I'm asking that you look at this jail challenge from another point of view and to take this issue up just one more level. About half of my personnel in the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office and budget are dedicated to jail and court security. In 2016, we booked about 32,000 people through the front doors. That's down from 40,000 bookings just a decade ago when I came in as sheriff. We are a pre-adjudication facility, which means we hold people until trial and adjudication. We do not hold post-adjudication. We have a functional capacity of about 750, and my daily population count has been hovering at about 100 to 150 above those numbers. And keep that in mind. My overall bookings are down about 20 to 25% over a decade ago, but my jail population day to day, up. Why? Because the largest majority of arrests and bookings at the Hennepin County Jail occur when our courts are not at work. Arrestees become inmates, and then they wait hours and sometimes days for the court to convene between 8 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. Monday through Friday, excluding holidays. It is not being critical of our criminal justice partners. It is just a simple fact in my county. I know other parts of the country do things a little bit different, but if you want to get at criminal justice reform, here's another way to do just that. Hundreds of these inmates should never have been incarcerated because they're neither a flight risk nor a threat to public safety. In 2016, we had at least 2,000 probable cause bookings that expired after 36 hours. That's 2,000 people booked into the jail who were never criminally charged. As law enforcement officers, we are the most visible and present agents of government in our communities, our crime-impacted communities. When people need help, they call 911. When a family's in crisis, they call 911. When someone disturbing the peace, public intoxication, trespassing, what do? They call 911. 40 hours a week just isn't good enough when law enforcement answers 911 calls 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we have residents subject to arrest 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A great example of this is a guy named Garrett. Garrett's an 18-year-old man from Minneapolis. He was arrested by Brooklyn Center Police, a suburb just north of Minneapolis in my county, for probable cause identity theft, a nonviolent crime. He was booked into jail on Friday, September 1st, and released 4 days later on Tuesday, September 5th, at 3 o'clock due to the Labor Day holiday. No criminal charges were ever brought against Garrett. Get it? He sat there for 4 days, no criminal charges. He wasn't a threat to society. Our courts should never be systematizing the question of who should be in jail with a working presumption that everyone should be in custody. And I know what maybe some people might think, that, hey, he's soft on crime. Couldn't be farther from the truth. Anybody that knows me and the work that we've done back in Hennepin County. In fact, it's just reality. If you look at violent offenders, I've always had room in my jail. But in law enforcement, we do our best. We don't always get it right. You've heard that said before this morning. You're going to hear that said again, I think, throughout the day. We want our jails reserved for the people who are afraid of, not the people who are just mad at or frustrated with. And we need our courts, our prosecutors, and our public defenders to fulfill their constitutional mission and make sure that we ask the right questions on the front end of the jail time instead of after the fact. And for that, I thank you, and I look forward to the rest of our discussion on the panel.
Chairman Serpis, you led the group that brought together today's summit. Your group sent its recommendations to the Trump administration and the Sessions Justice Department this morning, calling upon them to take up effective, modern strategy, smart on crime, not just tough on crime. The Justice Department and the Trump administration don't seem at this point to be necessarily positioned to agree with you. Do you have any reason for optimism that they will hear what you and your fellow chiefs here are saying?
Of course I do. We came together 2 years ago when President Obama was still in office. And we came together because we knew we had a voice that was real and it was based on frontline experience, making the differences in this nation. And our letter to the president today speaks about 5 simple things. Focus federal funding on fighting violent crime, not on low-level crimes. We have to have sentencing reform. More than 30 or upwards of 30 states in America have already made meaningful changes in prison sentencing and criminal justice reform that has resulted in reducing arrest and reducing crime simultaneously. It can happen. The third thing is we have to recognize, and Sheriff Stanek just hit that nail square on the head. Half of the people in our prisons and jails, 2.3 million people in prisons and jails in the United States, and half of them have a diagnosed mental health issue. We are treating them with jailers and coppers as opposed to doctors and nurses, and somehow or another are astonished year in and year out their plight gets worse in life. We have to just think through that more carefully. I'm the father-in-law of 2 police officers. God knows what my daughters were thinking. I did everything I could to try to help them. But that's what I worry about. I worry about my two son-in-laws who are going to confront not necessarily that armed, dangerous criminal in an alleyway. That's a very unlikely event. They're far more likely to confront someone who is off of their medication or can't get their medication, who sees the world in a completely different fashion than these two young officers are trying to explain. And we all know the ultimate opportunity could be that use of force is going to occur, and somebody's going to go home hurt. And that's something we as a nation should be able to do better. When you give people a chance for meaningful reentry and rehabilitation training and they want it, now that I'm a social scientist, it works. Now, are there people who choose not to be rehabilitated? Of course there are. But the people who want that can be successfully helped. There's no question about it. Community policing is the grease that runs the prosecution and criminal justice system in America. When people feel comfortable and confident in working with the police through justice and legitimacy, we know from the research that they're more likely to follow the rules themselves. We know from justice and legitimacy research they're more likely to ascribe that behavior to others and to participate in the system of justice. And the real critical issue for those of us who have been in law enforcement, the third piece of justice and legitimacy, is they're more likely to give you that moment in time to trust your judgment till you get to the bottom of a crisis. So community policing, federal sentencing reform, focusing on violent crime, dealing with reentry and rehabilitation are simple, straightforward messages that all of us in law enforcement agree with. The other thing is criminal justice reform for the sake of police reform alone is not criminal justice reform. There's been a lot of talk about police reform all the way going back to the Wickersham Commission in the 1930s. Criminal justice reform is not just reforming the police. We have to look more broadly at the entire criminal justice system. And in this last year and a half, as a professor now at Loyola University, New Orleans, and working with the IACP and the funding from the Department of Justice at the end of the last administration, we have visited 15 cities in the country that are 21st century departments. Let me tell you what I found. And I wasn't surprised to find it, but when I say it aloud, sometimes people are surprised to hear it. Every department we went to, from the biggest in Atlanta all the way down to Kewaunee County, Michigan, officers want alternatives to arrest. Sue Rohr in Seattle has done a tremendous job at helping teaching officers alternatives. LEAD in Seattle, Miami-Dade County, Baltimore's adopting LEAD. Folks, the jury is out on this question. The majority of police officers, if you give them an alternative to arrest, they would prefer to use that than put someone in jail. We have to recognize, final point, I like football. You like football? Yeah. I thought Joe Montana was the greatest quarterback that ever lived on earth. But to think about it, this is kind of our analogy here. To tell Tom Brady that he has to play Joe Montana's offense is like Jeff Sessions telling us we have to return to arresting everything that moves. It doesn't work.
So I'm going to ask a few follow-up questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions for reporters. I'm not going to be able to ask a follow-up of every single person here, just so we have time for the journalists in the room to ask their questions. But I do want to draw out some of the different ways that people have prioritized. You've talked about the need for people to prioritize on what's important for their city or their county. Chief Newsham, you've put a big emphasis on instructing officers to prioritize finding and confiscating illegal firearms. Chief Acevedo's strategy has been more to divert lower-level offenders away from jail to save more space for violent offenders. It's not necessarily mutually exclusive, but there are different emphases. Can you explain why you chose your strategy?
I think that without question, the number one thing that's contributing to violent crime in our city is illegal firearms, 100%. No doubt in my mind. We looked at motives back in the late 80s, early 90s during the crack epidemic. Motives were largely over drug disputes, turf wars, territories. Now our number one motive in our violent crimes, our shootings and our homicides, is petty disputes. And I think what happens is you have a illegal firearm introduced into a petty dispute, and then that's when we have a problem. And so, there's two ways to focus on the illegal firearms. Of course, it's the folks that are out there carrying it into our communities. But I think a more difficult challenge, and one where we could get some help from the federal government, is the trafficking of illegal firearms into our communities. You know, we look at, we don't manufacture or sell firearms in the District of Columbia. 1/3 of our firearms come from the state of Virginia. And I think that it's very easy to access or purchase firearms in the state of Virginia. And so I think, you know, we have a two-pronged approach, getting the folks that are out there carrying and finding a way to interdict those weapons that are coming into our city.
And Chief Acevedo, you want to talk about focusing on diverting lower-level offenders away from jail into other places that,
Well,
where they might get help?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I really think you have to do a risk versus gain assessment. And, you know, I always ask my community, when you have a home invasion robber downstairs and you're hiding in a closet upstairs, what would you prefer officers to do? Would you prefer them to be clear and be able to respond in minutes to your house to rescue you, or would you prefer they go book somebody for having, you know, residue on a pipe? And without exception, their preference is that we focus on violent crime. And so we are doing that in our city, in Houston, with brand new DA that now when we catch you with 4 ounces or less of marijuana, rather than take you to jail again, we have a contract that we actually give people right there on the side of the road. And they fill it out and they sign, and they have to go to classes, and they have to actually do something that proactively helps deal with the treatment. I'll never forget going on patrol when I first got to Houston, and with a young officer, and we stop a guy, and we get one rock, one little rock. That's it, which is for personal use. And unfortunately, it's you know, it's a felony. So what did we do? We booked this guy. Well, this guy is employed. He's got a job. He's actually coming home from work. You see a picture of his son. And my concern is now if that man loses his job because he's going to jail and then he can't afford bail because luckily we're moving towards bail reform where it's against risk-based and not just, you know, felonies are not all equal, right? And so we really believe that by focusing on helping people get help, making sure that we have a singular or a laser-like focus on violent crime, we're saving lives. And ultimately, for us in Houston, it's working. You know, our homicide rate this year is down 21% as of this morning. You know, that's over 50 people are alive today that wouldn't have been alive last year. And so, you know, it works. We have to push back. And I am hopeful, just like you, Ron, that the administration will listen, because you can't be the party or the administration that supports law enforcement and then not turn around and listen to law enforcement. You can't have it both ways. And I think that actions are louder than words, and so we're looking forward to seeing that support put into place by supporting what we're wanting, which is continue a playbook that has proven results and, most importantly, is consistent with what the communities that we serve and we're nearest to want us to focus on, which is violent crime.
Chief Scott, when you were appointed chief of the San Francisco Police Department, it was undergoing many reforms under the oversight of the Justice Department. Attorney General Sessions recently announced that the Justice Department would no longer be involved in departments in that capacity. Can you talk about your experience working with the Justice Department and the assistance they provided your department as you overtook leadership there?
Yes, the assistance was up until the point that they concluded that this process was very helpful. I mean, first of all, they did a comprehensive overview and a look at the policies and basic practices of the San Francisco Police Department, which gave us an outside view of the things that we needed to get better at and correct. With that came technical assistance, and that technical assistance was in those subject areas that were salient in the report: use of force, bias, accountability, which looked at our discipline system, our personnel recruitment and hiring and retention issues. And what came out of it before the work was concluded was the ability for us to actually take advantage of the technical assistance and actually implement a number of the reforms. I mean, we're about 50% in terms of the reforms that are either in the process of being substantially implemented or already implemented. Use of force policy being one of them. They were very instrumental in helping our police commission and police department basically revamp and update our use of force policy, which we believe will, in the long term, reduce some of the officer-involved shootings that really undermine the community trust in the police department. So those things were very instrumental, and that is the reason that we will continue the work despite the conclusion from the USDOJ. We will complete that work.
Chairman Serpis, you wanted to say something?
As many of you remember, I came back to New Orleans after having left and started in May of 2010 and did the criminal justice, the criminal investigation with the Department of Justice, Roy Austin and others, and negotiated the consent decree. And I think what gives me great pause after having lived through what New Orleans had to live through in the post-Katrina world, where officers were found guilty and convicted of conspiring to cover up murders and those issues. For the Department of Justice to back away from consent decrees too quickly ensures that we are likely to suffer the same mistakes again. Because putting aside for a second bad police leadership, there's a political process. Are the budgets being funded? Is inspections unit being funded? Is succession planning being funded? Is training, recruitment, and hiring being funded? And in many of the cities that the Department of Justice has investigated, not only was poor leadership in the police department part and parcel, but cities had essentially abdicated their responsibilities to properly fund and maintain these police departments. And if we're suddenly now seeing claims of victory across the country in New Orleans and other cities, that maybe that claim to victory is too soon, because those fundamental impediments to success don't change in 2 or 3 years.
One last question from me, and then I'm going to open it to other journalists. Chief Stevens, the tone of how we hear crime discussed by the Trump administration is very different from what we've heard on the panel today. We had the president in his inaugural address referred to American carnage. We've heard many references, especially on Twitter, to the crime waves in Chicago and Baltimore, saying that crime is out of control. What's your perspective?
Well, as I said initially, we did go through a couple of years where we had some pretty significant increases in violent crime in our major cities, and I think what's the president. It's hard to say what he thinks, but I think what we're hearing is a reaction to those places where we've seen those crime increases, and not and extrapolating that to the entire country when we know it's not the entire country, and we know that even in 15 and 16 with the increases, there was probably 8 or 10 cities that accounted for the majority of the increases that we saw in violent crime, and so they're cast in a broad net by saying that it's increases nationally when it's concentrated in those cities, but some of the challenges that those cities face. For example, Peter talked about the gun situation, and almost every one of the cities that have experienced these increases in violent crime in recent years, guns is a big part of that, and those chiefs have sought additional help from the federal government in terms of prosecutions for illegal for carrying guns illegally, and the Justice Department has responded in that area. They've been very supportive of trying to help them deal with the gun problems. So it's I think they've gone a little bit too far in their claims about the increases in violent crime, but I think they've tried to respond to those communities where there have been actual increases.
Thank you so much. I'd love to open the floor to any journalists that have any questions. Just raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on you. Tell us who you're from or where you're from. And if we don't have any journalists, I'm happy to open the floor to questions from any of the law enforcement personnel and other individuals here who are interested in criminal justice reform. Jack Date.
How do you do? Jack Date with ABC News. To what do you attribute the increase in violent crime over 15 and 16, and to what do you attribute the reduction?
I may not be the best person to answer that because it varies from community to community. Almost every chief, when we talk about these issues, talks about guns. Almost every chief, when we talk about these issues, talks about the impact of the opioid epidemic and the the sales dynamic, that's part of the increase in violence. But it varies from city to city, and some.
want to address it because what we never talk about, we never draw this correlation with officer morale and crime. Now, I've seen it in several cities where what we're not saying is that in some cities where officers don't feel supported, for whatever reason, they've shut down. And when they shut down, they're not doing the kind of police work. And I'm not dismissive of relationships in the community, but addressing crime in such a way that it draws it down. But you never hear it. Chiefs will never admit, well, I got a department that's full of low morale. And so a lot of times when cities look to replace chiefs, especially those that have troubled past, certainly one of the issues that continually comes up is what are you going to do to raise the morale? And when the morale goes up, crime goes up. I saw it in Los Angeles. Los Angeles in a consent decree. Certainly officers shut down. A new chief comes in, puts emphasis on the police officers and the work that they do, and all of a sudden crime starts going down. I'm not saying that's the only thing, but certainly that is a part of it, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And some of my colleagues don't readily mention that, but I'm telling you, I know this because I've seen it in several places. It does affect crime.
I'll just add a little bit too, because like Darrell said, every city, and we listened to those conversations. We all lived through that back in 2015 when most of us had significant increases in violent crime, homicides in particular, and we had that here in the district. And really, what we attributed it to was the illegal firearms, the access to high-capacity magazines. We were seeing more and more firearms represented on our shooting scenes, and more shell casings, indicative of more guns and higher capacity magazines. The other thing, too, that was the repeat violent offenders probably not being treated in a way that they could have been by the criminal justice system. And so we did do a lot with, we have to work with our federal partners on the supervision end. So we did do a lot with them, and I think that has had an impact. And so I say that to say, because we've heard a lot of conversation here by the chiefs, and I heard Eric Holder earlier say, by no stretch of the imagination is anyone on this panel sympathetic to a violent offender, because I don't think any of us are. And there are room in our jails for those folks. And so I don't want people to gray the line between what we're talking about here, which is folks who have mental health and substance abuse issues who are contributing to a lot of crime in our communities, a lot of nuisance, a lot of uncomfortableness for people who live in our communities with our violent offenders. Because I think sometimes that line gets grayed. And there's a tendency for some in our criminal justice system to not take those cases very seriously. And I think it's really important to draw that distinction. So when you have a violent criminal offender, that's somebody who has impacted a community and a family for the rest of their lives. And I think we need to make sure that those folks, the violent offenders, that the system pays particular attention to them to make sure that our communities are safe.
I need to add something real quick, because I think that, we keep talking about violent crime, yet the one instrument that is just in Vegas the other day, killed 58 Americans, is firearms. And again, if we're interested in, I tweeted the other day that some people say it's too soon the second you start talking about universal background checks or closing the gun show loophole, which is really more about background checks. If I call myself a private seller, I can go and sell anything I want to anybody if the price is right, and I can walk in and be a straw purchaser and do all these things. We are not going to, if we're really interested in impacting violent crime, let's have some gun sense. Let's have some discussions and talk about how do we keep guns and protect the Second Amendment by keeping firearms in the hands of law-abiding Americans of sound mind. And sadly, a school, a church, a theater, a concert, when is enough going to be enough? And when are we going to start talking about gun sense? And when are we going to talk about protecting the Second Amendment by keeping firearms? They talk about Chicago. Well, the reason Chicago has a proliferation of firearms, it's because the guns come from Indiana. It's just silliness. And so, we can either be serious about combating violent crime, we can be serious about keeping Americans safe and stopping the carnage or we can detract from it by talking about low-level drug offenders and having mandatory sentences for them. And so the other thing is for gun violence is if the guns aren't the problem, it's the people. Well, let's keep the guns in the right hands. And when people use firearms inappropriately during the commission of a felony, let's hold them accountable and save prison space for the people that do the most harm, and that's people with firearms shooting us and shooting our families and shooting our cops.
Jack, before I go into another reporter, did you have a follow-up that you wanted to ask? You're good. Okay, cool. Any other journalists have a question? If not, then I can go. Yes, please.
Hi, Julia Hart with Reuters. Attorney General Sessions has attributed the rise in violent crime repeatedly to illegal immigration. This isn't a factor I heard any of you mention just now, but the DOJ is using it, trying to use it as a basis to cut off policing funding, burn JAG grants, and COPS funding to police departments around the country. I'm wondering if, cities or counties that have enacted so-called sanctuary policies, in your eyes, have experienced the rise in violent crime that the Attorney General says they should be experiencing, and how the cuts to funding that the DOJ is trying to enact would
I don't think
affect.
there's evidence to support that.
Okay.
Chief Acevedo, you represent.
Well, I'm from Texas, so
yeah,
I'm a border state, and I can just tell you that there's, to me, that rhetoric is again about feeding the political base of a party, and sometimes the left does it, sometimes the right does it. It's more about political theater and primary politics. The data, the studies show very clearly that undocumented immigrants are underrepresented in terms of being engaged in criminal activity. The reason that we've been successful, the biggest reason, by the way, you cannot draw conclusions based on 1 year of data, or you just can't do it. You got to look at least 5 years. That's why when I look at my crime, I look at trends that are at least 3 to 5 years, because any given year things are going to change. But what we need is we need to continue our commitment to community policing, which I don't like calling community policing because we don't have the resources. Baloney. Relational policing. Relationships matter. What happened with SB 4, Senate Bill 4 in Texas during that rhetoric and the debate, our reporting of sexual assaults in the first quarter of 2017 versus 2016 by the Hispanic community in the city of Houston, fourth largest city in the country, fastest growing city over 1 million, went down by 42.8%. Yet when you look at sexual assaults by other ethnic groups and other races, guess what? It went up. And the unintended consequence of that rhetoric, the unintended consequence of pushing people back into the shadows, is that you lose 11 to 15 million victims and witnesses to crime, and that's a loss for all Americans, a loss of public safety. So, there is the data doesn't show it, but unfortunately, I think it's more about political theater feeding the next primary election instead of feeding good public policy and discussion.
Chief Scott.
Let me add real quick, too. Somebody has to speak for the cops here. There's a little over 500 people in this nation that can do something to make rational decisions with immigration and immigration reform. And it's not the 800,000 cops who are 24 years old on average patrolling the streets in the middle of the night. It's the members of the United States Congress, the United States Senate, and ultimately the Supreme Court. And to continue to foist this national disgrace and headache on the backs of police officers, and deputies and troopers who have to confront these people hiding in the shadows, is an embarrassment. So until we start putting the focus on the United States Congress, on the United States Senate, who have the responsibility and duty to pass laws, and get off the backs of these police officers, this debate continues to be misdirected.
Chief Scott, I'd love to get your thoughts, just because obviously during the campaign, San Francisco being a sanctuary city and the tragic murder of Katie Steinle were big talking points for President Trump.
Yeah, no, I think this tends to undermine not only public safety, but the health of any community. Because when you have any segment of a population that does not want to access either, public safety, law enforcement, or city government, it's unhealthy for a community. I mean, San Francisco is very, very strong on its values in terms of immigration policies and sanctuary city policies, very strong values. And I personally believe that that's a good thing, because we have to have people engaging civically in the communities that they live in. And when they don't trust that our immigration policies are not only just, but that they are out to do things that are, in my opinion, just counter to common sense in terms of having people access government, access police departments when they need them, call 911 or report crime when they're a victim of a crime. It just undermines common sense and public safety. So for us, I think, that incident that you referenced, although tragic, I don't think changes the need to have sound policies in terms of immigration. And it doesn't change the need that, in terms of San Francisco, we firmly believe that good immigration policy and the police department support on not asking about immigration status, not enforcing immigration laws, because that's the federal government's job, is in the best interest of the community and public safety.
Okay, are there any other? Yes, sir.
Tom Jackman from the Washington Post. Chief Acevedo, what do you have against Joe Montana? Just kidding.
I'm from L.A. and Los Angeles, and I was a Rams
Come
fan
on.
growing up.
It's because we beat Texas twice. That's what it was.
Come on, catch up.
This is a very detailed and specific letter that you've sent to the President and the Attorney General, and this is an impressive gathering you have here today. But what next? Are you going to meet with the Attorney General? Are you going to lobby? What now? I mean, he might get this letter, and it comes in with his junk mail, and the letter from Citibank, and off it goes. So, Citibank's great. Are they a sponsor? And so,
So we're
On the letter, so I'm sure they'll get it.
so you're okay.
We're going to continue, as we have for the last 2 years, the Law Enforcement Leaders Group, because of our membership representing all 50 states. We have voices throughout America in all the states, and we continue to be able and willing and at any moment ready to discuss the intimacies of these 5, 6 proposals. And we thank the media for continuing to keep this as an issue on the minds of the American voter and the American reader of criminal justice reform. So we're not stopping. We're moving forward. We've been in place for 2 full years now. This is our 2nd anniversary. And clearly, I think we're gaining momentum and will continue to gain momentum.
Any other reporters?
Just from the perspective of the Major City Chiefs Association, most of these points are points that we have been working on for a number of years into the President Obama's administration, reentry, prison reform. All of those issues have been a part of things, expanding community policing, have all been a part of what we believe is good public policy for helping keeping America safe. So it's a continuing march forward to try to implement these practices and policies. Sometimes you take some steps forward and some backwards, but it's a continuing process to move forward. And I think our organization for sure will continue to focus on these issues.
Any other questions? It can be from a non-journalist if anybody has anything they want to raise. Yes, sir.
We see so often that we have the active shooter situations. And the first thing that's said, either from the media or from a community leader, is, well, the person obviously has a mental health issue. So let's enter into a debate on the Second Amendment. How come the leaders cannot stop at the core of the problem and start looking at the co-occurring disorders of mental health and addictions and start working with Congress to get funding to the states to start dealing with those issues? But they walk right by mental health and they start going on something that's just is going to go nowhere. And we've seen that from Sandy Hook. If they aren't going to do anything after first graders are slain, then nothing else is going to move that debate. But let's go back to mental health and appropriately funded.
But I think the reason that the debate doesn't move forward is that people that are in law enforcement, 18,000 police chiefs, if we continue to talk about it and not stop talking about it, sooner or later, guess what's going to happen? The problem is we talk about it for a week, then life continues, and we just move on. We need to continue to talk about it and not stop. And just like we need to continue to talk about the mental health issue that you deal with in your jails, and that Greg, I think about 70-80% of his people that we put in that jail had mental health issues. So it's got to be a comprehensive approach to criminal justice reform, not just one issue.
We have to remember, too, every administration in the United States Congress and the United States presidency since 1996 has not stopped the defunding of research of gun violence in America. That's President Clinton, President Obama, and President Trump. and that's Speaker Pelosi, that's Speaker Boner, that's all of them. Since 1996, there's been a prohibition about using money to study gun violence in America. We know more about the mating habits of squirrels than we do about studying gun violence in America.
Can I ask you a question to follow that up? There obviously seems to be a nexus between mental health issues and access to firearms. And while maybe it's difficult for the Congress, or not even difficult, maybe they don't want to enact more restrictions on gun ownership, is there something that you have seen from your on-the-ground, on-the-streets experience where individuals with mental health issues could be prevented? Not everybody who's ever seen a psychiatrist, I mean, but somebody who might be potentially violent. Is there any way a police officer or judicial system could impose some sort of restriction to prevent people who shouldn't be able to get access to guns from getting them? Or is it just all theory and not practical?
I think it's practical. I mean, in California, there's a wait period, first of all. In order, if you want to legally obtain a firearm, there's a wait period. And during that wait period, certain background checks have to be done. But beyond that, there are situations where people are, because of mental health issues, prohibited from carrying firearms, and the law gives law enforcement a right to check up on prohibited possessors. I mean, there's several different categories of prohibited possessors, people that are prohibited from owning firearms, and the law in California at least does give us the authority to follow up on those issues, and oftentimes we do find that people who are prohibited from possessing firearms in possession of them, and we have to enforce on those laws. So I think there are things that can be done to help that situation. Mainly, let's enforce the laws that we do have for this issue, because there are laws. I'm sure California is not the only state where we do have some tools at our disposal to address this issue, but we have to be relentless on making sure that people who are deemed not to own firearms, that they don't own them.
This is a state issue as well, probably in today's world more significantly a state issue than perhaps a federal issue. We've seen a whole series of what I would call nutty policies that have been implemented across the country. Carrying a concealed weapon without a permit, just open carry. We see people at these demonstrations and marches with the armed militia. And we expect our police officers to be able to sort all of that craziness out when something goes wrong. We expect them to be exactly perfect. And those policies, I think, have made it much more difficult for them to keep people safe in their communities. And we've got to focus on the states as well as the federal government.
Sheriff Stanek?
Yeah, this question came up right after the Sandy Hook shooting as well, and that is the NICS checks, right? So as a sheriff in my county, I issue the permits to carry. We have about 35,000 of them in my county. It's gone up exponentially over the past decade under both Presidents Obama and President Trump. But with NICS, you have to do the criminal history checks, not just in your state, but around the country. But you also get the adjudicated mental health records, meaning those that are public or by the courts. And states have to contribute to that. It can't be a voluntary basis, otherwise you get this piecemeal system across the country. Whether Minnesota and when I came in as sheriff, Minnesota did not contribute to it. We had to force our legislature to contribute to it, but other states, same way. And you should go back and check whether your state contributes to the NICS database in terms of the adjudicated mental health records. That's just a simple thing to get at.
If we can put some faith in Gallup polling, the American population is of a split mind on gun control. Significant majorities of Americans support meaningful background checks, removing guns from people who could be violent and have past criminal records and domestic violence. But an also equal number of Americans do not believe that the government or the police can keep them safe. And then there's a smaller percentage, it's a majority, but there's a smaller percentage, around 54 or 55%, who believe to be self-armed can protect themselves from the random shooter. So you can see there's just two completely different sets of minds here that play to each political ideology. Whichever side you want to be on, you can say a large majority of Americans support your view.
Yeah, I'm going to add just a little bit more difficulty to this. You know this is a difficult topic, but the adjudicated mental health records are 100% helpful. but it probably doesn't get you where you need to go. I think if you look at some of the mass shootings that we've had in our country, we don't have histories of adjudicated mental health issues. So we probably have to go a step further when it comes to allowing people to carry firearms in our community. And I think there also has to be some thought given to the need to have high-powered rifles in our community. Those weapons were manufactured for killing human beings in wartime situations. There's not really a lot of other use for them, particularly in our major cities. And I think when you get, you talk about and this is, if someone in the room can solve this problem, raise your hand, because this would be very helpful. Having the governments have access to significant mental health records before they issue licenses to possess or carry firearms is critically important. And then given some common sense thought to the types of weapons that we're going to allow to be in our communities, particularly in our major cities in the country.
I want to thank everybody on the panel for their thoughts and their passion, and thank you for being a great audience. Appreciate it.